With war comes controversy. There have always been people who have spoken out and opposed the vast loss of human life associated with times of war. The Vietnam War of the 1960s and 70s was no exception, as a large wave of protests swept over the United States. This anti-war protest movement was spearheaded by the younger generations, in particular high school and college students who strove for love and peace.
Vietnam is also the scene of a powerful aggression that is spurred by an appetite for conquest. It is the arena where communist expansionism is most aggressively at work in the world today, where it is crossing international frontiers in violation of international agreements, where it is killing and kidnapping, where it is ruthlessly attempting to bend free people to its will. And into this mixture of subversion and war, of terror and hope, America has entered.
By 1963, the U.S. presence in Vietnam was constantly growing, and the number of American advisors in Vietnam was above 10,000. Tensions were constantly rising. These tensions came to a crescendo in 1965 when President Johnson commenced the bombing of North Vietnam and made the decision to send American ground troops to the region. His decision to send in ground troops resulted in an increase in draft numbers. While many Americans opposed and protested involvement in Vietnam at this point, protests greatly increased in the late 60s as draft numbers began to increase in the United States, dove deeper into war. The first major protests of the Vietnam War came in 1965, when the draft was increased to 33,000 men a month as a result of the U.S.'s decision to increase ground troops in Vietnam. Many young men tore up or burned their draft letters as a display of their disapproval of the war. Muhammad Ali, the world heavyweight boxing champion at the time, publicly burned his draft letter. As a result of this, he was stripped of his title. However, his strong public stance increased anti-war feelings throughout America. The burning of draft papers was only the beginning of a long campaign of anti-war protests among America's young adults. As U.S. involvement increased in Vietnam, so did the protests back in America. The increase in bombing of Vietnam started major protests of the war across the country. The first national protest was held in Washington, D.C. in April of 1965, where between 15,000 and 25,000 people gathered at the Capitol. This large turnout surprised even the organizers of the march. The next major protest took place in Berkeley, California, where thousands gathered to debate the moral basis of war. From there on out, protests against the Vietnam War were headed mainly by white college students across the United States. The college protest that received the most press coverage was the protest at Kent State. It was here that a peaceful demonstration turned violent when the Ohio National Guard opened fire on the student gathering. During the incident, 4 students were killed and 16 others injured. This incident caused thousands of students to take to the streets in disapproval of the bloodshed caused by the American government. After this point in time, the protests became more and more violent, ranging from low-level vandalism to arson and bombings. These protests, along with the hundreds of others, put increased pressure on the American government to call for peace. Minorities, in particular African Americans, were extremely upset and heavily protested the war. The war began to require more money, and as a result, Lyndon Johnson decided to raise taxes. This put extreme pressure on the poor citizens of the United States, which especially angered African Americans because they were often oppressed. Martin Luther King Jr. once stated that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor as long as Vietnam continued to draw men and skills and money like some demonic, destructive suction tube. This shows another reason for African American anger over the war. Because many college students and other affluent people dodged the draft, African Americans feared that they would be forced into service since they had no way to avoid it like others did. The largest reason for African American disapproval of the war was the fact that African Americans were often not allowed to vote. Black civil rights leaders stated that they were very offended that they had to support a war with money and men, that they had no voice in whether or not it should be fought in the first place. Many Americans agreed with the anti-war movement and identified with the statements that were made by its leaders. However, some anti-war protesters were more extreme than others, and there were instances where the more radical protesters lost support from some of the moderate critics of the war. One instance of this divide in support was when actress Jane Fonda traveled to North Vietnam and made some statements that the more moderate faction of the movement felt uncomfortable endorsing. Among the statements made by Fonda were references to Nixon as a new type Hitler. She also told South Vietnamese soldiers to desert the army because she stated they were being used as a force for U.S. imperialism.
I believe that the people who are speaking out against the war, be they Republicans or Democrats, are patriots. I resent the fact that our flag is being taken away from us by people who are bombing civilian targets, keeping our prisoners of war in the jails there. The prisoners of war themselves are aware of what's happening. I talked with 7 of them, and they said to me, we believe that if Richard Nixon is reelected, we're going to be here forever.
Overall, this event in 1972 did not completely eliminate the more moderate support for the anti-war movement, but it did make many Americans think of Fonda as a traitor. Overall, the anti-war protest movement during the time of the Vietnam War was one of the largest and most successful movements of all time. It was not without its failures and misunderstandings at times, but the movement did achieve its primary goal of making it known to politicians that a large amount of Americans did not support U.S. intervention in Vietnam. Therefore, it can be said that the young men and women who refused to go off and fight were just as instrumental in ending the war as those who attempted to defeat the enemy.